Okay, so this is a new kind of tips and tricks thing we're going to do while we're all in quarantine. My name's Tim. I'm the press studio manager here at Megalo, and I'm just going to kind of run you through Photoshop, mostly for how I use it in combination with all of my traditional printmaking stuff, but some of this will be useful if you want to venture into making digital prints as well. Yeah, so today, pretty simple. We're going to go over the preferences, the menu, and the sidebar. Basically just an introduction to where things are in Photoshop, and then every video from here on out will actually kind of do something a little bit more targeted. So this is more of just an introduction. Yeah, all right, cool. Let's get started. First thing we're going to go over is preferences. So you click on up here, Photoshop CC, come down to preferences, and just click general. Here we got a couple different things. General, I never really do too much. I don't think there's too much important to say in here. Feel free to play around with basically any of the settings in all of Photoshop. The best way to learn things is just start clicking on stuff and figure out what it does. Interface, here's where you can change your theme colors. Some of them I find pretty unpleasant to look at. I like this kind of medium dark gray color, but feel free, again, like I said, play around with any of this. Workspace, I'm going to skip over, as is tools. Here are just some of the things that, large tabs, not really interested. Tools, I don't have a scroll wheel, so I don't really worry about too many of these things. History log is kind of interesting. I never use it, but if you click on history log, you can choose to have your history saved as a text file to different things, so you could kind of wherever you wanted. We're not going to do that. We're going to turn that off, but it's something you could have. That would basically just be, you could read back through and see, to do that particular effect, I used the brush, the select, the art history brush, and the crop tool in those orders, or I don't know, something like that. File handling, I figured it was kind of nice to notice that right here we have our automatic save. I have mine set to 10 minutes. That's pretty good. 5 minutes, I don't know, that's probably a bit overkill. 1 hour doesn't seem like enough. Your call. It's just Photoshop will save your stuff every 10 minutes. My power cord isn't that great with the wall connection, so sometimes I kick it out, and it's really frustrating if I've been working without autosave on and my computer shuts down. So I like 10 minutes. Let's see here. Next thing, we got export. Nothing really to worry about here, but you could change your quick exports to JPEGs if you wanted at a particular quality. I leave mine at PNG. Performance, here you can see how much RAM is available and how much Photoshop's allowed to use. You could bump this up to make it run faster, but you run the risk of crashing your computer if you've got too many other things taking up RAM. The interesting thing here is this history states. I like mine set at 50. This means I can step backwards 50 times. Photoshop will remember 50 things I've done, and I can go back and forth between those 50. But if I've done something and it's the 51st time, if I go back 50 steps and I want to get to that one more, Photoshop's going to forget that I've done it. You can bump this up all the way to 1,000. Might make Photoshop run a bit slower. My teacher always suggested that he would use 500. I like 50. It usually works good enough for me. It's kind of the default, so that's what I do. Scratch disks, if you have an external hard drive, this is probably where you'll be able to find it. I think it basically, whenever I've used scratch disks in the past, it kind of just frees up space on your computer, so your computer can deal with the processing of Photoshop, and your scratch disk can kind of have all of your other files saved. I'm not really good with scratch disks, so it might be worth looking up someone who knows more about computers to kind of explain scratch disks. I don't use them. Cursors, here again you can just play around with different styles. So standard shows you the brush, precise shows you the crosshairs, normal is this little circle, full size is just a bigger version of that. You can have the crosshairs show up or not. These are all personal preference kind of things. Transparency and gamut, that's kind of your background transparent color. You can choose all these different sorts of things. Again, all personal preference. Units and rulers, I've got mine set to millimeters. I'm way more comfortable in inches because I'm from New York, but we're in Australia, so let's use millimeters. Type also can be millimeters, pixels, or points. Points is the type sizing system that comes from letterpress printing. It's always just kind of set to points, so that's what I use. Print resolution and screen resolution, 372. Most printers, high-end printers like Canons, Epsons, things like that, they'll print out at the max 300, so you don't need any higher than that. And your screens are generally going to be a 72 pixels per inch resolution. Is going to be good enough to look good on a screen. Guides, grids, and slices. We'll go over this much more in depth later on in different lessons. These are all just kind of colors and different things. I think when I switched mine to millimeters from inches, this was 127, which is probably the millimeter to inch conversion. I just set it at 100 because that makes more sense using the metric system. Plugins, don't really worry about ever. I never use them. You could probably download a whole bunch of stuff. This would be more useful if you're someone who's into kind of glitch art or doing different stuff. You can get different programs to have Photoshop do things like that. I'm not really good at it, but it's out there for people who are interested in digital art. Type, again, you can change all sorts of things in type. Photoshop will do 3D stuff. We won't get into this. I think for most part, if you're going to work in 3D, you're probably going to want things like Blender or other programs than Photoshop anyway. Although I think what you can use 3D for is if you're going to design like a printout that you're going to put on like a beer can, you can actually do a mock-up in Photoshop. You can have your label made in Photoshop, and then you can use a 3D beer can or pop can or soda can or whatever in Photoshop and see what your design's going to look like wrapped around. So that's kind of cool. But other than that, Photoshop's not the best for 3D stuff. And enhanced controls and technology, never used them, not even going to go into them. One last thing is that if you change anything in this menu before you open a new window, it will set these preferences to every single new window you open. If you already have a document open and you go and change preferences, it will only change preferences for that window. When you close that document out and open up a new one, it's going to go back to the factory settings or whatever you had in this window. So I recommend, if you know what you like, open up Photoshop, don't open a document, change all your preferences, hit OK, and then anything you open from here on out will be to your preference settings. Okay, so now we're going to go to Create New, and my computer's going a little slow, so this might take a second, but go to Create New, we get New Document. There's tons of presets you can play with. I'm going to go over all the custom stuff because then you can change anything, but standard photo size is, let's say you want art and illustration, you want 18 by 24 inch poster at 300 DPI, boom, hit go, you're all set. But like I said, I'm going to go to a custom size because once you understand how to change these, you can go to any of those preset stuff and modify it or just, get exactly what you want. While it's nice to have an 18 by 24 poster size, doesn't really help if I'm working on a 22 by 30 rock, in the litho studio. So let's go in here. First, you got your title. So you can come in here and say, test for Megalo, something like that. That looks pretty good. Then you got your width and your height. This is already set in inches. Could go, if we wanted millimeters. Like I said, I'm comfortable in inches, so I leave this in inches. But once I open this up, you'll see that my rulers at the top and bottom are set to millimeters. Resolution, again, if you're going to work on a print that you're going to print out with a Canon or an Epson, you want to leave this at 300. If you're going to leave it on the screen or you don't really care about the resolution or, it doesn't really matter to you, like sometimes it won't to me, and we'll get into that in later lessons, you can drop this down to 72 or whatever. But 300 is pretty good, so we could leave it there. Color mode is just kind of a bit personal preference. We've got a couple different things. Bit mapping is good if we want this to be for screen printing. Grayscale, black and white. RGB is red, green, and blue. Those are those digital process colors that are for like LED lights that actually project light, where all the colors mix to give you white, versus our printing process colors, CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black. And those are when everything mixes together, you get black instead of white. That's kind of the difference between these two, is one's digital, one's print. Any of them work. So really, for our purposes in these demos or tips and tricks, doesn't really matter. I'm probably gonna leave mine at RGB, but you play around with either. 8-bit's gonna be fine. Background contents, I normally have white, is pretty good. You can always just use the paint bucket once you're in to change it. If you go to advanced options, I already have them open, and the one I really want to talk about is this first one, color profile. We have working RGB is sRGB, which stands for screen RGB. It's kind of a bad color profile. It's pretty limited, and if you're just working on the screen and you're not really worried about the color, like I'm normally using Photoshop to do digital sketches for my traditional prints on stone or etching or woodcut. So I don't really ever mind. I normally leave it on sRGB, but if you're gonna like really worry about the color of things, you're editing an actual photograph or you're gonna do a digital print, you want to come and switch to either Apple RGB or Adobe RGB 1998. I think this is the better one, the 1998 one, because it's Adobe. So you could switch over to that. If you were to have picked CMYK and you go to this, you'll notice a whole bunch of different ones. These again are kind of more for if you're gonna send your file to a commercial printer. You're gonna want to know, are you printing on uncoated paper, newsprint, web coated, all sorts of different things. Is it Japan, US? You're gonna just want to make sure that your printers, and I mean that both in like the actual machine and the worker. If you want to know what their settings are going to be, and you want to design your files for the equipment they have, and it's best not to assume that everyone's got what you have. You can almost assume that they don't have what you have. So you should always check with whoever you're going to get to print your work for you. But again, I'll leave this RGB, and we'll go Adobe RGB. Cool. Now just hit create. So there's our document. Again, it's at 8.5 by 11. In landscape orientation, but up at the top, these are all in millimeters because I made those initial preference changes there. Okay, so from there, we got our menu. So we'll go through everything at the top. This is our menu, and then we'll go through everything down here in the toolbar. First up, we got file. This is pretty basic stuff that most programs use, so this should be self-explanatory. If you're not really good with computers, I apologize for how quickly I'm going to gloss over this. Basically what I think is pretty cool in here is down here it says automate, and you got these first two batch. Batch does kind of, if you've got like 50 Photoshop documents and you want the exact same thing to happen to all of them, you can write a script in batch and you can hit run and it'll do it to all your open documents. It's pretty cool. I'll do a lesson on that later. And then you got PDF presentation. I use this all the time for making PDFs to send to grants, residencies, exhibitions, things like that. We'll do a lesson on PDF presentations because it's super useful. A lot of times you might make a PDF and it's like 300 megs and you can't send it over Google. Well, using Photoshop's PDF presentation, you can make everything look nice and neat and consistent, but you can also select different save settings that your final file is only going to be like maybe a meg at most, and it's really nice for sending those digital files that look good on the screen, don't need to be printed. Yeah, it's a pretty cool one. We'll go over in a lesson on that in a couple weeks probably. And then the last thing here is the print function. Probably do a lesson on print functions, but basically with this, every printer is a little bit different. You kind of just need to know the general rules and then set up your system for your printer. We'll do that separately. Okay, so here in the edit form, the keys that I really want to point out are down here. We've got transform. It's currently grayed out because I don't have anything to transform, but this is a super useful tool. It's how we make things bigger, smaller, flip them around, do all sorts of weird things. That's a really useful tool, so we'll come back to that later. Define brush preset. We can actually like make our own brushes and patterns in Photoshop, which is kind of nice for, I guess, in screen printing. It could be really useful to make kind of repeat patterns or different things like that. So those are kind of neat that we'll go into in later lessons. Down here, let's see, we got color settings and assign profiles. If you forgot to change sRGB to Adobe RGB 1988, or 1998, no worries. You can just come down here and change things midway through working, and it's no problem. Let's see, keyboard shortcuts are really important. You can click on this and you can edit things. So for example, if you want to deselect something, right now it's Command D, that's just going to be what it's set to. But let's say for whatever reason you wanted to change that to Shift Option Command 2, you can do that. So we can go into that. Again, different lessons. Menus and toolbars. Again, menus up at the top, toolbars on the side, and that's what we're going over today. These are all just to kind of continue to work in those preferences of yours, how you want Photoshop to work for you and look for you on your computer. Okay, image. Mode, again, if you didn't set it at the beginning, like let's say I wanted CMYK, forgot to change it, just go change it right now. This will be useful when we're going from a finished image into something that we can print out as a bitmap for Photoshop. I'll show you how to get from these two all the way down to this grayed out bitmap one. That'll be later on. The adjustments tab is pretty cool. This is where you can do all these different different things like change brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and exposure are all kind of in this category. You can see these lines that are showing, this is all one group and they all kind of do the same thing. Vibrance, hue, saturation, color balance, this is all kind of similar tools. So if they're in a group like this, chances are they're all going to do something within the same idea. So if you're looking for new things to play with, that's kind of a way to navigate through Photoshop. Invert, posterize, and threshold. These ones are pretty useful for kind of making, for screen printing, I would say particularly. Threshold I use a lot. It basically sets a limit. Anything that's darker than that limit will turn solid black. Anything lighter than that limit will turn pure white. And it's really good for making those kind of just black and white, for making a paper screen stencil if you wanted to. Let's see, from there, back into image. Okay, so these adjustments, these are all what's called destructive editing. It means once you do them and you go on, you can't change it, so that's not the most ideal. We'll get into the difference between destructive and non-destructive editing a bit later on, a different lesson. Okay, so then let's see, another probably useful one, image size. This changes, it seems pretty self-explanatory. This changes the size of the image. So we can increase the resolution or decrease the resolution. We can, everything changes all at once. The canvas size, on the other hand, right now we have an 8.5 by 11 canvas. Let's say we had a smiley face on here and we wanted the smiley face to be bigger, we'd use image size. Let's say we wanted the smiley face to remain the same, but we wanted it to not be 8.5 by 11, we want it to be 18 by 24. We'd go to canvas size and make this 18 by 24. So I'll go and show you that again later on in our actual lessons. Okay, those are the important ones here. Okay, layer. So this is where I was talking about earlier. If we go down to new adjustment layer, all of these are the exact same things that we had over in image and adjustments. The difference is we can have this as a separate layer, and so we can turn that on and off. We're not left with it. We can go back and edit. These are all non-destructive editing, and that's really important later on when we're trying to make changes to our document that we're not maybe 100% sure of, or we might want to change later down the line. We'd rather use a new adjustment layer. Okay, next, layer mask. Layer masks are going to be important later on, so I just wanted to mention that this is where they are. And I'm not going to go too far into them, but layer masks are going to be super useful for us. Rasterize right here being grayed out again because I don't have anything that needs this right now. Rasterizing, there's two types of images. There's raster images and there's vector images. Photoshop works in raster images, and things like type or paths that it can kind of handle will eventually need to be rasterized. We'll talk about that a lot later. Things like Illustrator, they use vectors, and so if you import anything into Photoshop from Illustrator, it'll need to rasterize it before you can kind of edit it in Photoshop. Okay, so down here we have these merge, layers, and flatten image. This is kind of where if we've got separate layers. We can combine them together to edit them as one. Sometimes it's useful to do. And flatten image, again, this will be useful when you're about to print things off. If you have 40 layers in your Photoshop document, it'll just take longer to print. So you always want to flatten before you print, and that'll compress everything down to a background layer. Just makes things go quicker. Okay, type, not going to mention too much about it. Again, this kind of goes into things like rasterized type layer is what I think is important here, but there's other ways to get to that rasterized type layer, which is kind of an important thing to note for Photoshop. I'm going to show you things a way that I do it, but kind of with most things in life, there's probably 5, 10, 20 different ways to do the exact same thing. My way is not right. It's just the way that I've gotten comfortable with. So feel free to look up YouTube videos from other people. And, once you have use my videos to get kind of comfortable, and then just experiment and find your own ways of working. Because again, some things are faster, shorter, and they're just what you like doing. Okay, so important thing here in Select, really important part of Photoshop, and probably our entire next lesson will be about making selections in our images. So deselect, as you could probably think, a lot of this will be self-explanatory. It takes away a selection that you had just made. Reselect will reselect something that you just deselected. And inverse will take whatever you have selected and select the opposite of it. All three pretty useful. One thing that I really like using is color range. This will let you pick everything that's white or green or blue or I don't know, any color that you got on your screen. You can select that color, which can be useful for changing colors or for getting rid of things that you don't want, all that kind of stuff. Edit in quick mask mode is also pretty useful. And again, we'll do a whole lesson on masks and what to do with them later on. Filter, plenty of things on here. I'm not going to go over any of them. They're fun, but for our purposes, kind of not necessarily super useful. But go ahead and play around with them because, you could end up making some stuff here that would be kind of cool that you could translate into traditional printmaking. Let's see, down here in, stylize, you could have... I think maybe trace contour, that could give you something that might give you a pretty interesting image that you could turn into an etching or something. I don't know, something like that. 3D, again, as I mentioned, Photoshop can do it. We're not going to go over it. View, probably some pretty cool things in the view. Let's see here. Rulers is pretty good. Rulers, as you can see, we can take those off. View, rulers, okay, I figure finally I've done something rather than just talk. Rulers is kind of cool. Snap and Snap to are very useful. Snap to guides, this will be kind of cool. We went over guides very, very, very briefly in the last, or like at the beginning of this, when I was going over preferences with all the color combinations. With the guides, let's say you want something at 5 centimeters. Well, that's 5.2 centimeters. It's 50.2 millimeters. The way I did this, I went over to the rule, I clicked, and I dragged it out. I'm at 60, close. I want it to be perfect, though. I could kind of get there, maybe. That took a while. So let's say I want one to 7. I can get it pretty close. I can go to View, Snap to Guides. I can then click on this one, right? Kind of pain. I want it to go right to 70. If I am holding down and I hit Shift, I can move it in increments and it'll go to 70, 80. It looks like it'll go every 2 millimeters to make things super easy for us. So that's what Snap 2 does, is kind of nice. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is window, and window again is more just preferences, so you can just arrange things all differently, change your workspace, which we'll get into eventually on different ways of doing that. But this is, again, if you want to see your history panel, I don't have mine selected, click history. It'll open it up. You can drag things down. See, and I went new drag guide. With this, I can click back to that, and it goes all the way back in my history brush. So that can be really useful. info some people like and need that and want that, so that can be really good. But yeah, so you can change how many different things you want to see. Let's say you like color, you want this color wheel over here instead of the swatches, do that. But if you want window, I like the swatches, so that's what I have up. So this is all, again, just preference. Use it, try it out, and make Photoshop look the way you want it to look because you're the one using it. Okay, and then last thing up here is the help mention. You can go to Photoshop help and tutorials and all that kind of stuff, whatever. What I think is useful is, let's say you forgot something. You know that keyboard shortcuts is a thing you can change. Do you remember where it is? Well, if you don't, you just type in keyboard. Oh, look, there's keyboard shortcuts, and it opens up and it points to where you want to go. So you can just click that and your keyboard shortcuts will open up. And you can go in and start, changing things around. Okay, so we've gone through our menu, we've gone through our preferences, our new document. Now the last thing we're going to do for today is go through the toolbar and get an introduction of what different tools we have to use. These are the things that let you kind of do stuff in a more direct way, and kind of what we're going to base most of the upcoming lessons around are these tools over here. So the first one up, we got our move tool, and this kind of, it lets you move stuff around. Like you can see in that little diagram, you just click on stuff, you drag it around. What's interesting to note, in these tools, you can see right here in the bottom right is a little arrow. Any of these that have a arrow in the bottom right, if you right click them, you'll get extra tools. And again, Photoshop groups things together in a way that makes sense, I guess. It puts similar tools together. So you got your move tool and your artboard tool. If we come down here to this next one, we just hover over it. It's the rectangular marquee tool or the selection tool. If we right click on that, we get an elliptical one or single row or single column. So it groups tools together based on how similar they are. These next three tools are all ways of making selections. So here, that makes a rectangle selection. And we can just select and we can move the selection around, change new selections, make it tall, short, square, whatever we want. The lasso tool, on the other hand, that makes us a free form. We can grab anything we want. So let's say we had the letter M and we wanted to grab the letter M. We could just trace the letter M, boom, and we've got our selection tool there. This one is called the quick selection tool, and this one will just kind of select. My whole background's white, so it kind of goes easy. Maybe I'll paint something first so that you can see what it is. So if I had a brush, a red brush, boom, and I could lasso tool that, right? There's one way. Or I could quick selection tool it. And because that contrast is really good, that's super easy to select. Okay, those are some of our selection tools. Like I said, next week we'll go way more in depth onto selection. We have our crop tool. So if we want to change this image, we just do that. Crop, that's our new image. Okay, eyedropper tool. This lets us pick colors. You can see that's red, or we can pick white, and it will change the color we want to get. Pretty useful. Let's see here. The next one is the spot healing brush. I'll have to teach myself a little bit about this one. I don't quite understand it yet. Then we have our brush tool, which is a paintbrush, all different sorts of settings we can go into. Clone stamp tool is really, really useful. It kind of allows us to grab areas of our image and duplicate them as a brush in a different thing. We'll go over on how to do that again in other lessons. Art history brush kind of lets us revert back to a way something used to be. Eraser tool is pretty self-explanatory. We can erase things with it. Paint bucket lets us fill in big blocks of color. So if I wanted to fill all that in black, I just grab the paint bucket tool and do that. Okay, then we got a blur tool, pretty self-explanatory. Dodge tool. Some things are a bit more tricky though, like dodge. I don't know why it's called dodge, but what I do know is that Photoshop tools, they're digital translations of darkroom techniques. So things like dodge, or burn or sponge. They're actual things you can do to films in a darkroom that the people who've coded this program have just kind of made mathematical representations of what they would look like on a screen. And that's really all Photoshop is. So if you know darkroom techniques, you're going to know kind of intuitively what some of these things mean a little bit better than some of us who don't. Okay, moving on, we've got our pen tool. This is more for making paths, which is kind of cool if you work with text or vectors. I'm not very good at vectors, but they're useful. So we'll probably go over the pen tool with making paths for typing things out on text. Go on, we've got our text tool. This is where we'll get into those different workspaces. So up here we have workspace and we've got graphic and web. That's going to give us a lot more things that will be options for our text tool. So we'll go into these different workspaces when we start working with text. Will be useful. Here we've got the path selection tool, path selection and direct selection. Again, these are more for vector-based images, but we'll go over those eventually, probably again in that lesson with text. Here we have a shape tool, rectangle, round, ellipse, polygon, line, and custom, all different shapes, which are, again, another vector type image. The hand tool, to be honest, I have no idea what this does. I'll look into it. Magnifying glass, super useful. Right now we got a plus sign. We can zoom in all the way. If we want to zoom out, we can right click. We got a couple options: fit on screen, 100%, 200, print size. Let's go to print size. That's what it looks like in print size, which probably isn't accurate. 100%, pretty up there. Fit on screen, fits on your screen. So that's kind of cool. Next things we've got our foreground and our background color. So right now, the foreground color is set to white, and you can change that to whatever you want. But if we have that set as white, if I grab the brush tool coincides with the foreground tool. That's white. If I grab the eraser tool, that coincides with the background color, which is black. So if I erase something, it will erase to black. Generally, white is your background color, so when you erase things, you're erasing back to white. And yeah, it seems kind of actually confusing to explain it the way I just did. When we start using layers, the eraser tool is just an eraser. It's not a colored paintbrush. It's actually an eraser. But that is kind of what it does. And then the last thing is, again, down here we have the quick mask tool, which if you click on, it's a weird thing. I'll just let's see here. What I'm going to leave you with is just a nice M for Megalo, because I'm going to do a whole lesson on masks, and we'll get to it some other time. So basically, I hope this was useful a little bit, at least for an introduction onto some of the tools that we have. In our upcoming lessons, we'll get a little bit more in depth into how to actually use them, so you don't just end up with this weird M that I drew with my mouse on my screen. So hope this is going to be a fun thing to keep doing while we're all stuck in quarantine, and a good way to learn some new skills for us to use when we get back into Megalo. And we'll see you around.